Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a conflict that, well, it's often called the forgotten conflict, but its impact, huge, absolutely central to the Cold War. We're talking, of course, about the Korean War.
Yeah, forgotten maybe in popular memory, but certainly not in its consequences. Our sources, military histories, geopolitical analyses, they really paint a picture of just how pivotal those 3 years were.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of dig into that narrative. We want to pull out the key moments, the strategic shocks, the human cost, and crucially, why this division on the Korean Peninsula still matters so much today. We're going beyond just the basic timeline here.
Right. And the first thing the sources really stress is the timing. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's right after World War II. The world's basically splitting into two camps, East and West, communism versus democracy. Korea. Well, Korea becomes the first major hot war in that Cold War standoff. It really solidified everything, NATO rearming, the whole containment idea. The 38th parallel was just the fault line where it finally cracked open.
And it cracked open incredibly fast. June 25th, 1950, that's the date. North Korean troops, armed with Soviet tanks, Soviet artillery, they just pour across the 38th parallel. What jumps out from the sources is the sheer speed and surprise of it all.
Absolutely. Strategic surprise is the key phrase early on. South Korean forces, the few American troops there, totally unprepared, overwhelmed.
And Seoul, the capital, falls
Yeah.
in just 3 days. Think about that, 3 days. You suddenly have hundreds of thousands of refugees streaming south, families ripped apart almost overnight. It was chaos, a humanitarian disaster from day one.
It was. And that initial shock, that near collapse, is what forces the world's hand. The UN Security Council steps in pretty quickly, actually, for a new organization. They authorize a coalition force, mostly American troops, of course, and led by General Douglas MacArthur, a huge figure coming off World War II.
But even with MacArthur, the situation he walked into was desperate. Which brings us to the brink of defeat phase. By August 1950, UN and South Korean forces are literally backed into a corner, this tiny pocket in the southeast, the Pusan perimeter.
And Pusan wasn't just a line on a map, it was everything. The sources make it clear. That perimeter contained the only major port still open. Ports needed to bring in troops, tanks, fuel, food, everything. If Pusan fell, well, that was probably it. Game over for the UN and Korea. North Korea would have won.
But it didn't fall.
Mm-hmm.
Against the odds, outnumbered, exhausted, they held that line. It's an incredible story of resistance.
It really is. Holding Pusan was crucial. It bought time.
And MacArthur used that time to plan something. Well, audacious doesn't quite cover it. A massive gamble. The Incheon landing?
Oh, Incheon!
Yeah.
Yeah, looking at the planning and the sources, it's fascinating,
Yeah.
terrifying. Easily one of the riskiest amphibious assaults ever attempted. The idea was brilliant strategically. Land behind enemy lines, cut their supply routes, retake Seoul.
But the risks were immense, weren't they?
Huge. You had these enormous tides, like 30-foot swings, narrow channels, mud flats. They only had a couple of very short windows, just a few hours, where the water was deep enough to actually land the troops and equipment. It needed perfect timing, pinpoint execution. So much could have gone wrong.
But it didn't. It worked. Spectacularly well, actually. The landing completely surprised the North Koreans. Their lines just collapsed. Within 2 weeks, Seoul is liberated. UN forces are pushing north. Suddenly, there's this feeling of hope, maybe even victory. The original goal, restoring the 38th parallel, was achieved.
Right. But then came the shift in thinking. And the next major turn in the war. With the North Korean army reeling, retreating back towards China, towards the Yalu River, MacArthur sees a bigger prize. He starts thinking, why just restore the border? Why not push on? Unite all of Korea under a non-communist government.
And this is where things escalate dramatically. We enter this frozen nightmare phase in late 1950. The sources are really clear on this. China was sending warnings, serious warnings. They told the UN, told the US, don't come near our border. Stop at the Yalu River.
They did, repeatedly. And this gets into that whole tricky issue of civilian control versus military ambition. MacArthur, well, he was riding high on the success of Incheon. He basically dismissed the warnings, brushed them off. He was convinced China was bluffing, that they wouldn't actually intervene, a fundamental misreading of the situation. He didn't seem to grasp that for China, this wasn't some distant conflict. It felt like a direct threat right on their doorstep.
So he pushed north. And China wasn't bluffing. What happened next was just staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, the, quote, People's Volunteer Army, start pouring across the Yalu River.
In secret initially. Under the cover of darkness, moving through the mountains, and they hit the UN forces who thought they were chasing a beaten enemy with incredible force, often at night, using bugles, wave attacks. It was terrifying, disorienting. The war wasn't just against North Korea anymore. Now it was China. A major power conflict had erupted.
And it erupted just as this brutal Korean winter set in.
Yeah, the cold itself became a weapon. The sources describe the peninsula turning into this just frozen hellscape. Temperatures plummeting way below freezing, equipment failing, frostbite becoming rampant. And if you want one story that captures the sheer horror and, frankly, the resilience of that winter, you have to look at the Chosin Reservoir.
Right, Chosin. It's iconic for a reason. You've got U.S. Marines, elements of the Army, completely surrounded up in the mountains, outnumbered maybe 10-1 by Chinese divisions.
10-1 in temperatures hitting -30 Fahrenheit, sometimes colder, the accounts. Troops fighting frostbite as much as the enemy, weapons freezing, morphine syrettes freezing, blood freezing, just brutal. Victory wasn't the goal anymore, it was survival, just getting out alive.
And they did fight their way out, that famous fighting retreat. The commander's line, "We are not retreating, we are merely advancing in another direction." It sounds defiant, but it was grim reality.
Absolutely. They fought their way 70 miles south, through ambushes, through the cold, bringing their wounded, carrying their dead. It wasn't a victory in any traditional sense, but managing to extract those units intact was an incredible feat of arms and endurance. But it also cemented the fact that this war was nowhere near over. The whole situation had reversed again.
Yeah, the Chinese intervention pushed the UN forces all the way back down the peninsula. Seoul changed hands again. Eventually, the front line kind of stabilized, roughly back near where it all started, around the 38th parallel.
And that leads us into the third phase, the stalemate. After all those dramatic swings, Pusan, Incheon, the Chinese entry of the war basically bogged down for the next 2 years, from mid-1951 to mid-1953.
People sometimes forget this part, but it was incredibly bloody.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't a quiet stalemate. It was brutal trench warfare. Think World War I, but on these Korean hills. Places like Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. Tiny bits of ground fought over endlessly. Hills would change hands dozens of times. Thousands of lives lost for maybe a few yards of terrain that had no real strategic value. It was a meat grinder.
All while peace talks were supposedly happening.
Exactly. The fighting on the front lines was directly linked to the negotiations happening at Panmunjom. Each side was trying to gain some small advantage on the ground to strengthen their bargaining position at the table. But the talks themselves were just as brutal in their own way, dragged on forever, stuck on issues like prisoner exchanges, particularly whether Chinese and North Korean POWs should be forced to return home if they didn't want to.
And this is also when the whole MacArthur situation reached its head, right?
Yes. While the war was grinding on, MacArthur was publicly criticizing the strategy, calling for escalation. He wanted to widen the war, maybe even use atomic bombs against China. This was a direct challenge to President Truman, to the whole principle of civilian control over the military. Truman felt he had no choice. He fired MacArthur. It was a huge political firestorm. But the sources see it as underscoring a new reality. This had to be a limited war. The risk of global, potentially nuclear war was just too high.
So this grinding, bloody stalemate continues, talks drag on, until finally they reach an agreement. Or rather, an agreement. July 27th, 1953. An armistice is signed.
And that word armistice is absolutely critical for you, the listener, to understand. The sources hammer this point home. An armistice is just a ceasefire. It stops the fighting. That's it. It is not a peace treaty. A peace treaty would formally end the war, resolve the political issues, maybe set permanent borders.
But that never happened.
Never happened. Still hasn't happened today. All the armistice did was draw a line, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, pretty much back along the 38th parallel where everything started. It created this heavily fortified buffer zone. And then silence. Like one source puts it, chillingly, no closure, just silence.
And the cost of reaching even that point, staggering. Over 3 million dead, estimates suggest. That includes soldiers from many nations, nearly 37,000 Americans, huge numbers of Chinese and Korean troops, both north and south, and just catastrophic numbers of civilian deaths.
A devastating human toll. And the result, a peninsula still divided. But the paths those two divided halves took afterwards couldn't be more different.
Yeah, it's stark when you look at it. South Korea.
South Korea, after being utterly destroyed, received massive Western aid, embraced a market economy, eventually transitioned to democracy, and today it's a global economic powerhouse, a vibrant democracy, a completely transformed nation.
And North Korea.
North Korea went the other way entirely, locked down under a totalitarian family dynasty, isolated, economically stagnant. It remains essentially frozen in that 1953 mindset. Technically, legally, still at war. The armistice rules still govern.
It's almost hard to believe. Same people, same language, same history up to that point, ending up in two such radically different places.
It really shows the profound impact of ideology and the geopolitical choices made back then.
So maybe it is the forgotten conflict in some ways, but looking back through these sources, its legacy is anything but forgettable. It set the stage for the Cold War, it showed the world the dangers and complexities of limited war in a nuclear age, and it left us with this major unresolved flashpoint.
Which leads to the final thought, really, for you listening today. That lack of closure isn't just history. Since 1953, there hasn't been peace on the Korean Peninsula, only that armistice. A pause, they're still, technically, legally, at war. So what does that actually mean for us now, for global security, for the economy, for regional stability? What are the real-world implications of having this major conflict officially unresolved? Just paused.
Paused along that line. That silence we mentioned, it's not necessarily peaceful. It might just be waiting.